Forget everything you know about Wicked. I'm going to set the story straight. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was written by L. Frank Baum in 1900 and was the first of a series of children's books set in the magical land of Oz. In 1939, that book was adapted into a wildly successful movie, The Wizard of Oz, starring Judy Garland, you know the one. Years later, in 1995, Gregory Maguire released this novel, Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West. As the title suggests, it's a kind of spin-off inspired by the character of the Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz, which was then adapted into a hugely successful musical by Stephen Schwartz and Winnie Holtzman. And that musical is now a pretty low-key movie. It's kind of underground, you might not have heard of it. I have been a huge fan of the musicals since I was a teenager, and this book has been on my TBR pile for years. I've even started it a few times, but just not really been able to get into it. But I still wanted to understand where one of my favourite musicals came from. So then I searched for this video, and it didn't exist. So then I decided to make this video, and now I understand why it didn't exist. Because this was an absolute mission. So if you enjoy it, please give it a like, maybe subscribe to my channel. This ended up being over double the length of my literal dissertation, but I did have fun most of the time. The Wicked Witch of the West is the absolute stereotype we think of when we think of an irredeemably evil character, but Gregory Maguire set out to put this idea of evil under a magnifying lens and find out what led the Wicked Witch of the West, who he named Elphaba after L. Frank Baum, to become this figure of evil. It asks the question, are people born wicked, or do they have wickedness thrust upon them? If someone's ridiculed and called wicked their whole life, is that enough to turn them wicked? It deals with some really interesting themes about life purpose and prejudice and nature versus nurture. Overall, it's a very interesting book with a lot of depth, and after watching this, maybe you'll decide to read it for yourself. But today, I'm going to do my absolute best to give you a SparkNotes version. As someone who knows every word to every song and even most of the Wicked script somewhere in the recesses of my brain, I really thought I knew the story of Wicked inside out. And then I read this book and it's like my whole world was turned upside down. It is so different and absolutely not family friendly. I'm actually quite worried about the number of children who might pick up this book after watching the film and think they're going to get that, because they're not. That being said, there's no denying that Gregory Maguire has a very impressive imagination. He took the world which had been laid out by L. Frank Baum in the Oz books and added religion, politics, culture, and many other things which are, at best, morally questionable, and at worst, definitely illegal. I'd heard this book was wild, but I went in almost completely blind, and it was so much weirder than I was expecting. Every time I thought I'd gotten to the weirdest point, Gregory laughed in my face and proved me wrong. There were several parts which made me feel so deeply uncomfortable that I really considered not making this video. However, I was curious and wanted to know the full story. So if you're watching this video, I'm going to assume you feel the same way, and I am going to give it to you. But I'm going to put some trigger warnings on the screen now, and I will say, watch at your own risk. There are a lot of difficult themes, and if you would rather stick with a shiny stage version, this is your chance to do that. Okay, if you're still here, I'm so sorry for some of the things you're going to be hearing today, but we're going to get through this together. Before we start on the actual story, I'm going to take a few minutes to explain a bit about the world which Elphaba lives in. I spent most of the book trying to piece this together, but I'm going to save you all some time and effort. It's going to seem like a lot of information to take in, but we need to study now so we can have an easy ride later, okay? If you've seen the show, you'll know that Elphaba lives in a world where animals can speak, but not all animals. The book makes the distinction between capital A animals, who can speak and are broadly in the same social class as humans, and lowercase a animals, who are like the animals we have here in our world. That distinction seems sensible enough when you're reading the book, but if you are listening as an audiobook, good luck. You just have to guess. In Oz, magic is a skill which you can learn, a bit like playing a musical instrument. You don't have to learn it, but you can if you want to, although it seems like not many people do, and it's quite controversial because some people think it's scary or it goes against their moral or religious beliefs. And speaking of religion, there are 3 in Oz that we need to know about, and their politics really overlap as well, so we're going to go over it kind of at the same time. The first and oldest religion is called Lurlenism, which is the belief that the fairy queen Lurline created Oz using magic. Lurlenists believe that the descendants of Lurline rule Oz as their birthright. Lurline's daughter was the first Ozma, and then when she died, another Ozma took over, and so on. Lurlinemas is celebrated in winter throughout Oz. It's basically Christmas, but the religion is dying out now, and it's typically only seen in the older generations. At the start of the book, the ruling Ozma is called Ozma Tipitarius. She's not very relevant because she's too young to rule, so her duties have been taken over by the Ozma regent until she's old enough to make her own decisions. However, the Ozma monarchy has been overthrown and have gone into hiding, so we don't hear much from them, but it's important to note that there is a lot of political unrest. The second and most common religion at the beginning of this story is called Unionism. Unionists worship the unnamed god. They follow a strict moral code which revolves around prayer, and they don't believe in using magic or indulging in pleasure in any sense, really. I can't believe I've just said indulging in pleasure. They believe that the unnamed god created Lurline, and also believe in a figure called the Cumbric Witch, who they see as evil, and she's often associated with like sexual imagery. And rumour has it, she created the third and final religion that we need to worry about anyway, which is called the Pleasure Faith. Pleasure faithists basically are just here for a good time. They use magic and they're all about overindulgence. It's kind of the opposite to unionism, and it's a growing faith in Oz, so it's getting more and more popular. So those are the religions. Now let's have a chat about geography. This is the map you will have seen if you've seen the musical, and you'll never see it the same way after watching this video, I'm afraid. But this is the map from Gregory Maguire's book, so I'm going to use this one. There are 5 distinct regions in Oz. Let's start in the middle with the Emerald City, which is the capital of Oz. Everything in the city is bright green. They all wear bright green, they wear the green glasses, and it's also home to the Wizard, who is the ruler of Oz after he overthrew the Ozma monarchy so he could have all the power to himself. It's also the military capital of Oz, and the Emerald City Home Guard keeps everyone in check. They're kind of somewhere between the police and the military. They answer to the Wizard, and they enforce his rules all over Oz. The rest of Oz is split into 4 sections. Starting up in the north, this is Gillikin. This is the wealthiest region, and they're quite technologically advanced and well connected in that it's the only region to have a railway system. The only place you really need to remember in Gillikin is Shiz, which is a big fancy uni. We'll come back to that later. In the east, we have Munchkin Land, where Dorothy landed in The Wizard of Oz. This is mostly farmland, and the people of Munchkin Land are typically very short. The houses are brightly coloured. You've seen Munchkin Land, you understand the vibes. I get the impression they're quite behind in terms of technology, and they're not particularly wealthy. The ruler of Munchkin Land is titled the Eminent Throp, which is relevant because the current Eminent Throp is Elphaba's great-grandfather. Spoiler, sorry. Each region has their own kind of ruling system, but all of them ultimately answer to the Wizard. So in Munchkin Land, their ruler is the Eminent Throp, and his palace is called Colwyn Grounds. In the south, we have Quadling Country, which is mostly marshland. The Quadlings have red skin, and they're sort of hippie and artistic, but they're right at the bottom of the food chain, and they're kind of seen as the lowest in society. And lastly, in the west, we have the Vincus, which is sometimes referred to as Winky Country. The Vincus is home to lots of different tribes, which are very spread out, and the land is quite uninhabitable in parts, with huge stretches of desert, lots of steep mountain ranges and things like that. From the Emerald City point of view, they're kind of seen as quite like feral. So to recap, we've got 5 regions. We've got the Emerald City, Gillikin, Munchkin Land, Quadling Country, and the Vincus/Winky Country. And we've got 3 religions. We've got Lurlenism, Unionism, and the Pleasure Faith. And the whole thing used to be ruled by the Ozma family, but they've been kicked off the throne and replaced with the Wizard. Right, I think that's everything you need to know before we start. Don't worry too much if you can't remember it all. I'll try and jog your memory as we go along. I'm going to get out and about, do a few costume changes to keep things interesting, and by the end, you'll know the original story of Wicked. Let's go. Our story begins in Rush Margins, a fishing village in Munchkin Land, where most people are devout unionists. Frexbar is a unionist minister who spends his time preaching and leading prayer in the Rush margins, reminding the people of their beliefs and morals. He's also a Munchkinlander, but you wouldn't really know from looking at him because one of his ancestors married into height. Frexbar, or Frex as he's more commonly known, has received a worrying letter from his cousin elsewhere in the country, who warns him about the mysterious Clock of the Time Dragon. Yes, the one from the top of the stage, which is basically a big clockwork puppet theatre. But the puppet theatre isn't showing Punch and Judy or Jack and Jill. Its stories are significantly more unsavoury. Frex's cousin writes about one particular performance which told the story of a man with 2 penises having an adulterous threesome with a widow and her daughter. Sorry, just thought I'd throw you in the deep end there. I know we've only just started, and I promise it does get weirder. Anyway, the puppet show had pointed fingers at one of the local townspeople, implying it was a true story about him and his double dick, and he was hunted down by an angry mob and severely beaten. It's unclear whether the story was actually true or not. Frex's cousin warns that the Clock of the Time Dragon is heading towards Rush margins. Frex thinks the clock is some sort of spiritual test, assuming its aim is to convert people to the pleasure faith because of the stories it tells of spectacle and violence. He takes to the street, shouting at the Munchkinlanders to remember their faith. When the puppet show arrives in town, it immediately begins to show a story about a minister who hoards money. Assuming this must be about Frex, and therefore assuming he's corrupt, the townspeople turn on him and start beating him up. The clock tells the townspeople to kill Frex and his family. A kind stranger takes Frex in and sends someone to be with his wife and keep her safe. The problem is that Frex's wife, Melina, is in active labour. A maiden, whatever that means, and a fishwife, whatever that means also, hide her in a wheelbarrow and try to get her away from her house to safety so she can give birth without being interrupted by a murderous mob or anything. The first quiet place they come across for shelter is the puppet theatre clock dragon thing, which is lying abandoned on the edge of a graveyard, which is the perfect place to have a baby, if you ask me. The 2 women deliver the baby, and in the meantime, Melina falls unconscious. When they hold the newborn up to the light, they realise there's something very wrong. Like a froggy ferny cabbage, the baby is unnaturally, you guessed it. They're also unable to distinguish the baby's gender to begin with, and this is something that comes up a few times throughout the book, but is never particularly elaborated on. The baby has sharp, pointy teeth, and when the fishwife puts her finger in Elphaba's mouth, she bites it clean off. Ooh, ow! They consider killing her, but instead decide to leave her alone with her unconscious mother and let nature decide what happens to them. Melina can't even bear to look at the thing, let alone care for it. The book says, it slept looking like a heap of cabbage leaves washed and left to drain on the table. Safe to say, Melina's motherly instinct hadn't really kicked in towards Elphaba, so she calls for Nanny to come and help. Melina's grandfather is the current eminent Throp, and Nanny was hired by Melina's family to help raise her. She seems to have no life whatsoever outside her job as nanny. You know when you're younger and you imagine that the teachers have literally nothing going on outside of school? It's kind of like that. Melina is chewing pinlobble leaves. That's drugs, I think. And drinking heavily, so she's asleep most of the time. Nanny spends a lot of her time trying to find the reason for Elphaba's green skin. She's a very unusual child, skin aside too. She seems a lot older and more developed than other babies her age, and she keeps trying to bite off her own hands. Frex is convinced that Elphaba was sent to him by the unnamed god as punishment for not being able to protect his flock from the pleasure faith. Nanny asks Melina if she slept with anyone else, and at first she says no, but then changes her tune and starts saying, well, Frex used to leave me alone all the time. So sometimes she had found comfort in giving passers-by a simple meal and a buoyant conversation. Is that what they're calling it these days? She then says that one man with a funny accent had given her a mystery drink from a green glass bottle, and she can't remember if she'd slept with him. Sounds non-consensual to me. Nanny tries to turn Elphaba's skin white by bathing her in milk and all sorts, but eventually it's time for her to leave. A year and a half later, Frex is away on another religious mission, leaving Elphaba and Melina at home together. Melina seems to have warmed to her daughter slightly, and she spends most of the day bitching to her about Frex. Elphaba is still a very mysterious child, and she doesn't seem to find pleasure in anything. There's a knock at the door, and Melina is naked, but she answers it anyway and invites the man in. The stranger's name is Turtle Heart. He's a glassblower from Quadling country who doesn't flinch at the colour of Elphaba's skin, although as a Quadling his skin is red, so maybe that's why. Him and Melina have some deep chats about spirituality, and then he blows a green glass shape and looks into it. Melina can't see anything except glass, but Elphaba does seem to be able to, and it's the first thing she's ever really taken an interest in. Turtleheart says he can see Frex travelling home with an elderly woman. Then him and Melina have a particularly energetic, buoyant conversation, if you catch my drift. Frex arrives with Nanny in tow, and they all have dinner together, Turtleheart included. They all talk together about religion and politics, and Turtleheart decides to stay a while. Towards the end of summer, Nanny and Melina discuss a beast which has been seen nearby. They're not sure if it's a bear or a wolf or something else. They also talk about Melina and Turtleheart's ongoing affair, which is a bit of an open secret, really. Melina justifies it by saying that it's basically given her the will to live again. They discuss Elphaba too. Nanny's concerned that she's not speaking yet and thinks she needs to start socialising with other children. Melina thinks it's wrong to expose her to the rest of the world because she knows she'll be bullied, but Nanny thinks she needs to grow a thick skin from an early age in the hopes it helps her learn to cope with being different. Ultimately, she blackmails Melina into agreeing by threatening to tell Frex about her affair. Elphaba is absolutely terrified of the lake near their house, and she won't go anywhere near it. She starts going to some sort of childcare with a lady called Gornette, who is a bit judgmental but does agree to look after her, and slowly she starts to play with the other children. And to be fair to Nanny, it does work in getting her to speak. Her first word is horrors. Frex is still away for days at a time, so Melina and Turtleheart only get closer and have even more buoyant conversations. Over dinner one evening, he tells Melina, Frex and Nanny that he left Quadling country because he's seen in his glass that there is going to be bloodshed. The Ozma Regent wants to build the yellow brick road through their land, but there are rubies underground, and once they're discovered, all hell will break loose. Frex suggests they all move to Quadling country to spread the Unionist faith to the people in need. But Melina puts an end to that plan pretty quickly when she announces that she is pregnant. Nanny tells her that after Elphaba was born, she went to the Emerald City and got a fortune teller called Yakel to mix up something that she could take to prevent her next baby from coming out green. Yakel had also spoken about a prophecy which involved two sisters being instrumental in the future of Oz. She said history waits to be written, and this family has a part in it. Melina takes the medicine and goes to bed. Nanny suddenly realises that with all the distraction, Elphaba has gone missing. She panics and starts searching unsuccessfully, but Turtleheart seems to be able to sense her presence and leads Nanny and Frex straight to her. She's under the dock in the arms of the beast, staring into one of Turtleheart's glass shapes and saying, horrors. When Turtleheart looks into the glass himself, he says, she sees him coming. He is to come from the air, a balloon from the sky, the colour of a bubble of blood. Ba, 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 ba. We have officially reached the first of many time jumps. It is now many years later, and we meet Galinda, who is described as a beautiful Gillicanese girl from the Pertha Hills. She's had a pretty middle-class upbringing, but she is obsessed with status and is desperately clinging on to some distant noble relatives for clout. We join Galinda when she is on the train to Shiz University, which is a fancy uni inspired by Oxford and Cambridge here in our world. Similarly to those, there are different colleges within Shiz, and Galinda is going to Crage Hall, which is an all-girls college. She is very proud to be the first girl from the Pertha Hills to be accepted into Crage Hall, but she also knows it's not the best college at Shiz. All the girls at Crage Hall are expected to bring along an amma, which is an older woman's chaperone who keeps them in check and takes care of them. If you don't have an amma, that's a sign that you're poor, and you basically become a social outcast. I want a book about the girls without ammas. I want to know what they get up to. Galinda's chaperone is called Amma Clutch, but she's not here right now because she stepped on a rusty nail and had to go to hospital. So Galinda's on the train alone, and she's quite pleased about it because she's a little bitch. In the first class carriage, Galinda meets a capital G goat, Dr. Dillamond. They introduce themselves to each other, and Dr. Dillamond has a hard time pronouncing her name. So Galinda gives us a glimpse of her horrible character once again when she immediately takes offence. Personally, I think she should be giving him a little bit more credit for being able to speak at all, since he is, in fact, a goat. A goat. Dr. Dillamond is talking about the fact that the rights of capital A animals are starting to be stripped away. He asks Galinda about her opinions on the wizard's proposed ban on animal travel, explaining that he hates the idea of capital A animals having to travel in pens with the lowercase a animals, which sounds fair enough. He's a bit too chatty for a stranger on a train, in my opinion, but he's not doing anything wrong. Galinda, however, is like, yeah, that doesn't affect me, so whatever. When she gets off the train, she sees a capital E elephant, a capital T tiger, and several other capital A animals. They're quite common in wealthier areas like Shiz, but she's not seen many of them before. Be careful, Galinda, your mid-level social class is showing. She's quite overwhelmed, so Dr. Dillamond is far kinder than she deserves and calls and pays for a carriage to take her straight to Crage Hall. This is where we meet Madame Morrible, the headmistress of Crage Hall. She is described as a giant, fish-faced Gillicanese woman, and she's terrifying from the off, to be honest. She has a little robot creature called Grommatic who follows her around and does everything for her. Like Dobby in spirit, but I imagine him to look more like Wally. If Dobby and Wally had a baby. All the Amas gather together in one room and all the students gather together in another. Galinda spends the whole time being super judgmental. She's like, it's really trashy to travel in jewels, by the way. I have loads of my own, I definitely do, don't even worry about it, but I'd never wear them to travel because some of us have class. Now it's time to choose a roommate, except it turns out the Amas had been given the task of pairing students up with someone who would be socially beneficial to them, and because Galinda's Ama isn't there yet, she had gone unrepresented, which wipes the smug smile off her face so fast. So all of the wealthy girls are paired off, leaving 15 who don't have Amas to be thrown into the collective pink dormitory to rot. Galinda is having absolutely none of it, and she runs up to Madame Morrible saying there's been some big mistake because she's definitely not of dormitory class. Ew. The headmistress asks where her Ama is, and Galinda feels like saying she stepped on a rusty nail sounds a bit pathetic, so she makes up a story, which she thinks will help her get her way. She says that Ama Clutch had a nasty fall and is having an episode where she speaks to inanimate objects like forks and spoons. That's important, by the way. Remember that for later. And that she'll hopefully feel better and will be back soon. So Madame Morrible agrees to put Galinda in a double room instead of the disgusting group dormitory for poor girls, as long as her Ama will chaperone another girl too once she arrives. She is, of course, referring to Elphaba, who is now of university age, but is just as green as ever.
You can room with Miss Galinda.
Throughout the coming weeks, Galinda makes new friends who are all significantly wealthier than she is, but she tries so hard to hide it from them. We have a few new characters here. So there's Fanny, who was pronounced Fanny in my head while I was reading it, but I've since learned that's incorrect. It's Fanny. And Fanny is a Munchkinlander, but not one of the gross poor ones. They make that very clear. And we also have Shen Shen, who is the wealthiest. That's all we really know about her because honestly, that's all Galinda cares about. According to my notes, there is also a third friend called Miller, who I honestly completely forgot about because she's not particularly relevant, except in one bit later, but she exists too. The girls all gossip about Elphaba's poverty and her lack of fashion sense and her green skin. Galinda uses the fact that she's sharing a room with Elphaba as social leverage because she can spy on her and bring them new things to bitch about. So Galinda spends most of her time out with her friends, but when Elphaba isn't in class, she mostly just sits in their bedroom reading. About 3 months after moving in together, they finally have their first conversation. Whoa. Galinda asks what she's reading. Elphaba answers that she only really reads about religion and politics, but she doesn't have fun doing it, so she's not really sure why she does it. They actually have quite good banter, and then Galinda suggests that Elphaba tries on one of her hats. obviously. Elphaba says she doesn't wear pretty things, which broke my heart a bit actually, but eventually she agrees to put it on, and Galinda is absolutely shocked and horrified to find that she actually looks pretty in the hat. This is not that hat, by the way, it's an orange one. Elphaba hates showing any kind of emotion, so she brings the conversation back to her reading. She says this particular essay is thinking about good and evil, which feels very on the nose. Galinda, in a shockingly humble turn of events, says she's not good at reading or thinking, but as she gets further into the conversation, she actually gets quite involved. And Elphaba's excited by the fact that Galinda does appear to be thinking. But when she tells her that, Galinda rolls over and says, "I'm about to sleep, because this is profoundly boring to me." There's no way she could ruin her reputation by doing something as disgusting as thinking. The next day, she tells her friends that she'd had an awful night with Elphaba, who wouldn't stop talking about boring stuff, and that she looked stupid in her hat. I know she's not particularly likeable at the beginning of the musical, but Book Glinda really is something else. Madame Morrible throws a poetry soiree at Crage Hall. She invites the boys from the other colleges, but the girls are more interested in their professors, which is weird, by the way. She does an opening speech where she expresses her hopes that some nice poems might give them a break from all the unpleasant disruptions we have been hearing about in our nation's capital. It's giving the Hunger Games.
May the odds be ever in your favour.
The professors seem to understand what she's getting at, but none of the girls have any idea. And since it doesn't affect them, it's just not their problem. Elphaba arrives just in time to hear the headmistress reading a poem about religion and society, which ends with the line, "Animals should be seen and not heard."
Yes, well, perhaps these questions that I have prepared... Oh my God!
Dr. Dillamond and the other capital A animal professors are obviously fuming. In the chaos, Elphaba picks up a chair and puts it down in between Galinda and Shen Shen. And she starts speaking to Galinda. And Galinda is so embarrassed and she doesn't want to be seen speaking to the poor green girl. So she's absolutely thrilled when a boy interrupts their conversation. This is Bok, who plays a much larger role in the book than in the musical. He's a Munchkinlander who attends Briscoe Hall, which is one of the boys' colleges at Shiz. Galinda's first impression is that he wasn't much to look at, but anything was better than the green leech at her side. So that's good. Bok says he actually knew Elphaba when they were children. His father was the mayor of the town that she'd grown up in, and their paths had crossed at Gornet's, the childcare that Elphaba went to. Elphaba's quite rude. She says she doesn't remember him. I mean, I don't really remember anyone from nursery, but I suppose I might if they were green, so fair enough. Elphaba storms off to her room, so Galinda is left talking to Bok for a while, and when she eventually heads up to bed, Elphaba just pretends to be asleep. A few days later, the girls are in class, and Dr. Dillamond is ranting about what happened at the poetry soiree.
Something bad is happening in Oz.
He implies that there's a much bigger problem happening in the Emerald City, but the students have no idea what he's talking about. They live in their own little shiz bubble. So he explains that the Wizard of Oz has placed bans of animal mobility, meaning that capital A animals can no longer travel with or stay in the same accommodation as humans, and that any capital A animals coming of age were not allowed to work aside from on farmlands. Simply put, they're being oppressed. Elphaba is absolutely furious at the injustice that the capital A animals are facing, and never one to shy away from conflict. At one of Madame Morrible's lectures, she brings up the end of that poem. Morrible tells Elphaba that she's being silly and that the line could be seen as ironic. Elphaba talks back, Morrible kicks off, the other girls in the class sit back and watch the drama unfold. Morrible never really gives a straight answer, but she does say she doesn't think animals should have opinions on poetry. Nasty bit. At the beginning of the second semester, Galinda visits Madame Morrible to ask if she can be moved rooms. She says no, but she does suggest that Galinda should consider specialising in sorcery next year because she might just have a special talent. The next section of the book follows Bok. I told you he would have a much bigger part than in the musical. Exams are over and the summer holidays have just started. As I said before, Bok studies at Briscoe Hall, but he has a summer job in the library at Three Queens, which is another college at Shiz. We join him while he's looking out of his window towards Crage Hall in the hopes he might see Galinda getting undressed.
What?
We're introduced to Bok's friend, Averick. He's confident, handsome and intelligent, and he comes from money.
Here comes the smolder.
Honestly, honestly, he's similar to how Fiyero is portrayed in the musical, in my opinion.
Once again, the responsibility to corrupt my fellow students falls to me.
He's kind of the ringleader of the group of boys, but he is a good friend to Bok. Averick and the other boys are trying to get him to come out to the pub and to the mysterious philosophy club. More on that later. He says no, he's got to stay in and study, which is exactly what he's doing, obviously. Nothing weird. Bok is absolutely fixated on Galinda, and he's not having much luck seeing her from his bedroom window, so he leaves the empty dorm and tries to find somewhere a bit closer to Crage Hall where he can get a better look.
What?
He finds a roof he can climb on top of to watch, and while he can't spot Galinda, he likes watching the other girls anyway. Although he's a bit disappointed because they're not as pretty close up as they were in his head.
What?
A voice appears asking what he's doing, and he jumps out of his skin, falling off the roof and into the vegetable patch below. The voice belongs to Elphaba. She makes fun of him for falling off the roof, and they talk for a while. Bok is absolutely buzzing when he finds out that Elphaba shares a dorm with Galinda and asks if she likes him, but Elphaba doesn't know. She does offer to arrange a meeting between them though, so he can find out for himself. A few days later, Elphaba makes good on her promise and brings Galinda to the vegetable garden to see him. Galinda is mortified to learn about Bok's crush. She says he's too short and she doesn't want to marry a farmer from Munchkinland. He thinks she's even more sexy when she's angry, and convinces himself that she must want him really.
What?
I'm going to read a bit for you. If she hadn't had some affection for him, would she have worn a dress with a neckline that dipped just a tad lower than he had dared hope? He felt a surge of possibility, an inclination to rub his lips on the place where her shoulder became her neck.
What?
Ugh, he's such a little creep. He vows to keep trying, just as Amma Clutch turns up. She's fuming because Bok isn't allowed to be so close to Crage Hall, and she can't believe the girls are talking to him. Bok gets angry with Elphaba, saying he never should have trusted her.
What?
I love it when men react so reasonably to rejection. Galinda tries to diffuse the tension by saying she won't meet up with him again, but won't ignore him if their paths happen to cross. He says he's not satisfied with that, but it's a start.
What?
Over the summer holidays, Bok works his job at the Three Queens Library. There, he meets Crope and Tibbet, who are gossips, but nice boys. They come as a pair, really. The three of them become friends and often eat their lunch together out by the canal, which is called the Suicide Canal. For seemingly no reason, it's literally not mentioned again. About 3 weeks after the vegetable garden incident, the three boys bump into Galinda, Shen Shen and Fanay at the canal, with Amma Clutch, obviously. Although the other girls' Ammas are never mentioned, so I don't know where they are. Galinda is polite and friendly, as she promised, and Bok is a little creep, as we would expect. He fawns over her and says it's nice to see her spending summer at Shiz, but this offends her because higher class pupils typically leave for the summer, so she corrects him quickly and says she was going to go home to Pertha Hills, but it's such a long and tiresome journey that she's decided to stay with Fanay and Shen Shen at the holiday house they're hiring instead. Galinda also mentions that Elphaba has just got a summer job working under Dr. Dillamond at the lab and library. Not the same one as Bok, the one in Crage Hall. Tibbet and Crope are doing what any good friends would and making fun of Bok's crush on Galinda, so eventually she leaves. A couple of weeks later, Bok is out for a walk in the town and he looks around a tat shop which sells slogans from the various religions of Oz. He buys a newspaper which has been printed in the Emerald City. He hadn't seen a newspaper in a while, so he notices this one is a few weeks old but thinks it's better than nothing. And he reads through the headlines. Some capital A animals had tried to rebel in the Emerald City and got caught by the Emerald City Home Guard. Droughts had struck Munchkinland, which was ruining their crops. He reads that there were debates over the expense of building a canal system, using water from underground lakes in Winky Country to serve the whole of Oz. After a while, he looks up from his paper to see Elphaba walking towards him unchaperoned. They sit together and chat for a while. He tells her he will persist with Galinda, and she tells him that she is actually starting to like Galinda. She thinks there's more to her than meets the eye. Well, she says, behind her starry-eyed love of herself, there is a mind struggling to work. So almost a compliment. Ultimately, she says that she thinks there is a version of Galinda who could grow to have feelings for Bok.
What?
Give me strength. She goes on to talk about her work with Dr. Dillamond. He's looking into the biological differences between animals versus animals and animals versus humans. And Elphaba is his scribe because he can't write very well with his hoofs. He's having trouble because everything he can find on the topic is written from a religious perspective, but there's nothing scientific he can find at the library in Craig Hall. They're hoping that if he can prove there isn't any scientific difference between humans and capital A animals, then the bans on animal mobility will have to be scrapped. Box says he wishes that would work, but thinks it's unlikely because the wizard has dissolved any board which was able to make decisions and is now ruling without counsel. It's giving dictator. Elphaba thinks it's his responsibility to be open to new information as a man in power, but Bock is doubtful.
You're an idiot.
He offers to search the Briscoe Hall and Three Queens libraries for anything that might be helpful. And as she gets up to leave, Elphaba says she'll take him up on that, but asks him to keep it top secret. Bock, Crope and Tibbet all spend the summer helping Elphaba and Dillamond. Once a week, they meet to hand over their findings. It rains all summer and Elphaba wears a huge cloak so no water can touch her skin. The book says, Crope and Tibbet cared little about animals or the bans. They were both Emerald City boys, sons respectively of a tax collector and of a palace security advisor, but Elphaba's passionate belief in the work enlivened them. Elphaba and Bock grew to be good friends, but Bock spent the whole time wishing Galinda would join them. Dillamond seems to be making good progress, but is refusing to announce anything until he is finished. He's studying the religious ideas of how capital A animals came to be, in case it gives him any clues or helps him to dispute them and prove that science is the cause instead. Tibbet reads out a story from the Osiad, the Unionist religious text. He reads that the fairy queen Lurleen was on a voyage and became tired of flying, so she landed in the desert and summoned some water, which created the land of Oz. She drank the water and went to sleep. I'm going to quote from the book now. When she awoke, she relieved herself copiously, and this became the Gillikin River. Cool. So cool and normal. The story goes that the animals thought the raging stream was a flood sent to drown them. In a panic, some of them ran away and some of them flung themselves in and began to swim. Those that ran away remained as they were, and those that jumped into the piss river and started swimming were given the gifts of consciousness and language. But then Elphaba notices Grommatic lurking nearby and she feels uneasy, so they all leave. A couple of weeks before the next semester is due to start, Avaric returns, bronzed with summer leisure and eager for fun. Aren't we all? Elphaba receives a letter from Galinda inviting her to come and spend the last few days of the holidays at the holiday home near Lake George. Elphaba thinks Galinda's figured out she's not really cut out for the lifestyle of Fanny and Shen. And when Bock finds out about the invitation, he says he's worried about Galinda and tells Elphaba she has to go. She doesn't really want to, but Bock basically bribes her by saying she owed him a favour from all the help he's given her with the research. Elphaba agrees to go, but first needs to get permission from Madame Morrible. Amma Clutch is already there with Galinda, so Elphaba doesn't have a chaperone. Bock suggests that he and Avaric go too and stay in a nearby inn, and Madame Morrible agrees to let them escort Elphaba as long as they take Grommatic too. While they're travelling, Elphaba discovers that she doesn't like Avaric very much, and Avaric tries to talk about the philosophy club, and Bock gets all embarrassed and tells him not to talk about it in front of Elphaba. We will come back to that later. And Bock spends the journey worrying that Galinda might fancy Avaric. What a disaster that would be. Honestly, I have so little patience for this man. When they arrive at the house, the first person they see is Amma Clutch, who is so shocked to see Elphaba. Bock spots Galinda and shouts out to her, and she looks like she's seen a ghost. She's got no idea why they're there. Fanny and Shen start laughing, and Fanny admits she wrote the letter as a joke. Galinda is mortified, and Elphaba is so angry she stays in her room for the rest of the day. Galinda brings her food and sometimes stays for a few minutes, but nothing more. Bock and Avaric come over to play with the girls in the lake, and Fanny and Shen both swoon over Avaric. Bock asks Galinda to talk to him, so they sit on a velvet swing in private to discuss the letter, and then they kiss. What? And the scene just cuts there. The next thing we know, Elphaba, Galinda, Amma Clutch, Bock and Grommatic are all making the 6-hour return trip to Shiz in silence, leaving Averick to play with Fanay and Shen Shen. Once they were back at Shiz and Bock was back in the Three Queens library, he finds a picture of the Cumbric witch holding a drowned beast. He can't tell which species it was supposed to be, but she was breastfeeding it. She was also wearing silver shoes with the heels clicking together. Bock wonders if it implies that the Cumbric witch created animals, maybe? So he adds it to the pile to give to Elphaba for Dr. Dillamond. And when they meet, Elphaba tells him that every answer Dillamond finds just invites more questions and that he's been staying up into the night in the lab. Bock, obviously, asks after Galinda. Elphaba tells him that she's not interested, and then he tells her that Galinda is his world. She tells him that perhaps his world is too small. Finally, some sense, and they argue. She tells him that Galinda is lovely and everything, but Bock is worth a dozen of her, and then very quickly defends herself, saying, that doesn't mean I fancy you or anything, but Bock isn't really sure if he believes her. The next time Bock sees Elphaba and Galinda, he is walking with Averick. They see all of the girls leaving Crage Hall crying. Well, all except Elphaba, she's not crying. They ask what's happening, but the girls can't find the words. A doctor emerges carrying a body on a stretcher covered by a blanket. The wind blows the blanket off to reveal the dead body of Dr. Dillamond. His throat had been cut. Galinda tells the boys that Amma Clutch had noticed something unusual in the lab as she was putting them to bed last night. They weren't sure what she'd seen, but in the morning she never arrived with their tea like she usually did. After breakfast, they asked Madame Morrible if she'd seen her, and she told them she was in the infirmary. When they visited her, she seemed to be in shock. She was awake, but didn't seem to hear them. And then, as they'd been leaving, she began to speak to a long, rusty nail on a tray next to her bed. The official story surrounding Dr. Dillamond's death is that he fell onto a broken magnifying lens and impaled himself.
Oh, look at that. I've been impaled.
Elphaba tries to get some information out of Amma Clutch, but she's more interested in speaking to the flowers she brought her than to Elphaba, and she's really not making any sense. Galinda won't visit her Amma. She can't help but notice the similarities between Amma Clutch's symptoms and the lie she told Madame Morrible last year. The guilt is eating away at her. Remembering the trouble Dillamond had pronouncing her name, she's changed it.
In solidarity and to express my outrage, I shall henceforward be known no longer as Galinda, but as simply Glinda.
A couple of weeks pass and Amma Clutch is showing no signs of improvement. So Madame Morrible says that if they can't find a new chaperone, Elphaba and Glinda will need to be moved into the common dormitory. Glinda is obviously horrified by the idea, but Elphaba might have a solution. Bock is waiting for a coach to pull in from the Emerald City, carrying two important passengers. The first is Nanny, who had taken care of Elphaba when she was younger. She's kindly described as lethargic, careless, and saturated with resentment. Oh, and old, obviously. She's here to replace Amma Clutch as the girls' chaperone. Travelling with her is Elphaba's younger sister, Nessa Rose. She's quiet, polite, and a devout unionist, just like her father. She's not green like Elphaba, and at first Bock doesn't notice her disability because she wears a shawl to cover it, but Nessa Rose has no arms, which interferes with her balance and means she needs a lot of support from Nanny to stay upright when walking or even sitting. This had been largely Elphaba's job when they were growing up, as their father was either out on his religious missions and or too drunk to care for them. Nessa Rose is charming, and Bock immediately notices that she couldn't be much more different from her sister. To quote from the book, her voice was as smooth and oiled as Elphaba's was serrated. Bock escorts Nanny and Nessa Rose to Crage Hall. The whole way there, Nanny is gossiping about the Throp family. She says the family always was bright, and brightness, as you know, decays brilliantly. She goes on to explain that since Melina and her mother are dead, Elphaba is next in line as the eminent Throp. Nessa Rose hates all the gossiping and asks Nanny to stop because it hurts her soul. Elphaba and Nessa Rose are pleased to see one another. Bock was getting quite worried about Glinda, who seems very out of sorts recently, so he's pleased to see her admiring Nessa Rose's clothes. I would like to be let loose in Nessa's wardrobe for a few hours. It sounds like she slays in the clothing department. As I said before, she needs a lot of support, so Nanny feeds her while Elphaba props her head up. Madame Morrible has agreed to let Nessa Rose and Nanny have Amma Clutch's old room, which is adjoining onto Elphaba and Glinda's. And Glinda asks what will happen when her Amma comes back, but Morrible replies that she assumes this is now a permanent condition for Amma Clutch, which really upsets Glinda, and she leaves. Book would usually run after Glinda, but he doesn't bother. Partly because Shiz was low on professors now because of the animal bans, and the classes had been grouped together, so he knew he'd see her the next day, but mostly because he didn't find her as sexy now that she seems so upset all the time. Glinda knows she's changed. When she arrived at Shiz, she'd been vain and vapid, and now she found herself thinking, God forbid. She's so worried that what was happening to Amma Clutch was somehow all her fault, and she hadn't told anyone about her lie, but she doesn't really know what to believe. She wonders if it might mean she has a talent for sorcery like Madame Morrible had told her, and that maybe she talked up Amma Clutch's illness and caused it to happen in real life. So she decides to specialise in sorcery just in case. But she didn't totally trust Madame Morrible. She was the only other person who knew the story she'd told last year, and she thinks that's a bit suspicious. She's also decided that she doesn't want anything more to do with Fenay or Shen Shen, they're too shallow. But her friendship with Elphaba seems to be growing. Elphaba has confided in her about her family. Glinda had learned that Nessa had been born when Elphaba was 3 at Colwyn Grounds, which is the home of the eminent Throp in Munchkinland. There was an intense drought, so the Munchkinlanders had been praying to any god they could think of to get some water. They'd been doing pagan dances, and they'd even offered up a quadling glassblower, Turtle Heart, as a human sacrifice. After that, her parents had become missionaries to the Quadling people in Turtle Heart's honour, and they never returned to Munchkinland. 5 years later, Melina died in childbirth. Elphaba, Nessa Rose, and their brother, Shell, new character alert, moved around a lot as children while Frex worked and Nanny looked after them. Glinda and Elphaba had also discussed how Elphaba's family had been cast out of Quadling Country because the wizard's men had been ruby mining and killing anyone who got in their way, which was what Turtleheart predicted earlier, if you can remember. Glinda is pleased to know more about Elphaba, but she finds Nessa Rose quite annoying. She thinks she's demanding, and it winds her up when she prays and bows her head and cries a single tear in a spiritual epiphany. In a spiritual epiphany. Glinda is getting very into her sorcery lessons. One day, Nessa Rose asks how the university can teach sorcery when it was built as a unionist school. Glinda answers that there's nothing inherently religious or non-religious about sorcery. It's a skill, like reading and writing. Elphaba says she thinks that spells are anti-unionist because they're about entertainment and theatre, but she doesn't care because she's not religious anyway. Book and Elphaba meet up to discuss Dr. Dillerman's research. Elphaba ran into the lab on the day his body was found and saved everything she could, but she refuses to share it with Book. She thinks Dillerman might have been killed because someone didn't want his findings to go public, and she doesn't want to put Bock in harm's way too. They head to their life sciences class, which is now taught by Dillerman's replacement, Dr. Nicky Dick, who has a long beard he splits in half down the middle and then ties the ends around both wrists like bracelets. I had to read that line a few times just to check I wasn't making things up, but no, that is what it says. Dr. Nicky Dick is a mumbler, and the students can't really hear what he's saying, but he gets out a bottle labelled Extract of Biological Intention, which he pops open and a cloud of white powder wafts over the students, slowly filling the whole classroom. But the cloud is disrupted by a sudden gust of wind as the door is unexpectedly flung open to reveal a new student in suede leggings. If the leggings didn't give it away, Fiyero is finally here. He's from Winky Country and he's described as having deep brown skin with blue tattoos on his face in the shape of diamonds. There are no free seats at the front of the class and he doesn't want to interrupt, so he sits on the floor with his back to the door. But the gust of wind had thrown the powder off course and it had wafted up to a rack of antlers at the back, which suddenly come to life and start clattering their way to the front of the room.
Pesky pixie pestanomi!
Dr. Nicky Dick says he doesn't want anything from them and to blame the new student, so the antlers fly towards Fiyero, pinning him to the door, and one is just about to stab him in the face when Crope and Tibbet jump up and wrestle them to the floor. Fiyero is crying and seems quite traumatised, which is absolutely fair enough. He was doing better than I could have the second he walked into a lesson full of people that had already started. The way if I was even 1 minute late to any of my university lectures, I would just turn around and leave, because the thought of walking into a room full of people and them all turning around and look at me, oh my god, I just cannot do it. At the Life Sciences lecture the following week, everyone is talking about Fiyero. Averick says he's heard that he's a prince, but not really a wealthy one. He also makes a gross racist comment about his skin colour, but Elphaba shuts it down straight away. When the lecture starts, Dr. Nicky Dick rolls in a table with a lion cub crouching on it.
It is my job to arm you against the foulest creatures known to wizard kind.
The cub is shaking and looks terrified. All of the students seem quite uncomfortable, but Elphaba is the only one who speaks up, saying the cub is too young and it should be with its mother. Nicky Dick says his mother died in a sadly timed explosion. Sounds suspicious, but okay. He picks up a hammer and a syringe, and then 2 girls from the class grab the lion and make a run for it. Elphaba is shaking and pale and obviously really affected, but it's different from the musical. She doesn't save the lion. Over the coming weeks, a friendship group is formed. I'm going to do a quick roll call. So we've got Bock, Averick, Elphaba, Nessa Rose, with Nanny of course, Glinda, Crope, Tibbet, Fiyero, and occasionally Fanny, Shen and Miller. Bock isn't romantically interested in Glinda at all really anymore, but speaking of romantic interest, Fiyero reveals that he's actually married. He's the prince of the Arjiki tribe, and apparently in Winky Country it's very common to marry young. He got married at the age of 7, but he's only ever seen his wife once. He expects to get to know her more when he leaves Shiz and they start a family. Book Fiyero and musical Fiyero are pretty much 2 completely different people. They have very little in common except the same name. One evening, Gromatic comes searching for the Throp sisters and brings them to Madame Morrible, who's received a letter and a package for them from their father. Inside the parcel is a pair of silver shoes made of metal and glass. They're so beautiful that they all literally gasp when they see them, including Madame Morrible. Frex writes that he bought the shoes from some toothless tinker woman in Quadling Country and then decorated them himself with glass beads using techniques taught to him by Turtleheart. He says they're to keep Nessa's feet warm and dry and beautiful. There's nothing in the parcel for Elphaba. She helps Nessa put her new shoes on, but she's obviously offended. Later, the sisters are with their friends at the pub and they're telling stories about their childhood. Nessa's all have a bit of a creepy undertone, to be honest. There's one about Frex calling her his beautiful pet when she would fall into his lap and lean up smiling while he dropped pieces of apple into her mouth. She mentions that Elphaba is a good singer, so obviously the friends convince her to stand up and give them a song. Apparently even in the book, Elphaba's got pipes, because literally everyone in the pub stops to listen. Gromatic arrives with a note for Glinda saying that Amma Clutch is on her last legs. Madame Morrible meets the girls and Nanny by the doors to the infirmary and leads them over to her. Amma Clutch is still talking nonsense, and it's clear she's very unwell. Glinda asks Madame Morrible for privacy, and Morrible refuses, but Nanny literally elbows her out, leaving Elphaba and Glinda alone with their old chaperone. Glinda casts a spell on Amma Clutch, and she regains clarity for a couple of minutes. She tells the girls that she saw Gromatic stab Dr. Dillamond, and that she's made her peace with death, and then she dies. At her funeral, Madame Morrible is moaning about the fact that there's no cream due to the food shortages. She's described as a huge, upholstered, upended goldfish goddess in orange sequins. She says that if everyone would just obey the wizard, there would be no issues. A funeral seems like the perfect place to push your political agenda to me. She asks to see Glinda, Elphaba and Nessa Rose after the guests leave. She asks the girls about Amma Clutch's final moments, and Glinda says she'd talked absolute nonsense right up until her last breath. Morrible says she thinks the sight of Dr. Dillamond's blood might have been what drove Amma Clutch to insanity. Her version of the story goes that she'd noticed Dr. Dillamond's light was on late, so she sent Gromatic into his lab with a cup of tea, but instead the robot found him already dead. She then talks more about politics and her love for the wizard and explains that she's been given a crucial task: to recruit secret agents for the wizard. And she thinks the 3 girls have what it takes. She thinks Nessa Rose will make a great leader once she outgrows her religious beliefs. She thinks Elphaba has shown evidence of great internal power and force of will, and that Glinda is a very talented sorceress. She tells them all to go away and think about it and puts a spell on them so they can't discuss it with each other. The girls find Nanny and they all start walking over to the pub to meet their friends, but something weird comes over them and they start fainting and moaning. Nanny assumes Nessa's fainting because her shoes are too tight, so she takes them off and starts massaging her feet, and Nessa is like moaning and arching her back. I was reading this in a coffee shop. I felt embarrassed. By the time they got to the pub, their friends were all drunk and had decided to go to the philosophy club. Yes, that one. Fiyero asks Elphaba to go with them, but she says no. Glinda wants to go, but Elphaba says, "You can't. We're going to the Emerald City tonight, you little idiot. We have no time to waste on sex." Glinda seems shocked, partly because she didn't know what the Philosophy Club was, and partly because this was the first she'd heard of their trip to the Emerald City. And that is the last time the group of friends all saw each other ever again. Inside the Philosophy Club, there were humans, dwarves, elves, and capital A animals. Everyone's dancing, and Fanae and Bok start to get a bit nervous, so they're about to find the others and leave when the group gets called into another room. And what happens there, I can only really describe it as an interspecies orgy. Jesus Christ, the things this video is doing to my digital footprint. There's a very weird line where one of the other participants is described as a schoolgirl, but then the writer changes his mind and says it might not be a schoolgirl, it might actually be a woman on her honeymoon. Very easy to confuse the two, really, particularly in this context. Anyway, they're all naked and breathing in substances which are making them drowsy, and then Tibbet gets chosen to go in the middle with a woman and a tiger. A tiger. He seems quite reluctant to get involved, but isn't given much choice, and the scene cuts out there. So there's that. Meanwhile, Elphaba and Glinda are on their way to the Emerald City. At one point, Netta, Rose and Nanny are there as well, but they're not mentioned again on the trip, so I'm guessing that's just a plot hole. There's no direct train to the Emerald City, and they're travelling third class, so they're sharing a bed with all the other third class passengers. On the outskirts of the Emerald City, Elphaba looks out the window and sees famine, drought and emptiness. The architecture of the city itself is very impressive. Everything's tall and grand and green with gold accents, but the people are living in poverty. They're really giving, at the end of the day, you're another day older, if you catch my drift. There are 3 Gillicanese women dressed like ladies of the night, and the army walk around brandishing clubs and swords to keep people scared and quiet, basically. When they finally make it to see the wizard, they have to make an appointment for a 4-minute slot and remember to call him Your Highness, which is a bit eye-watering after spending a week travelling, but Elphaba is adamant she needs to speak to him. She makes a very good point that if the wizard has demolished the monarchy, why is he being treated so regally? Glinda tells her to shut up and stop causing trouble. The wizard's emerald throne is through a dark, windy corridor, and they take most of their 4 minutes just walking to it. When they eventually get there, the wizard is a skeleton made of lightning. As they speak, he starts taking out his teeth and juggling them and then throwing them into the air where they explode into teeth fireworks. I am tired. Elphaba name drops Madame Morrible to get him to take them seriously, and then starts talking to him about Dilliman's research and the implications of what he's doing to the capital A animals. He says that he knows of Dilliman's work and that it's derivative, uneducated, specious garbage, what you'd expect of an academic animal. He says he could care less about Dr. Dilliman, and that phrase always annoys me, because if you could care less, then you must care a bit. It should be couldn't care less, and that is a hill I'm willing to die on. Elphaba tries to tell the wizard he needs to sort himself out, and the wizard says it is not for a girl or a student or a citizen to assess what is wrong. It is a job of leaders, and why we exist. Elphaba says if she's not supposed to know what's right or wrong, then what's stopping her from assassinating him right now? Glinda pipes up and says she doesn't believe in assassination and it's time for them to leave. Back on the train, Glinda makes a little nest for her and Elphaba and guards her seat from the other passengers by saying it's her sister's. And then she realises that she actually does mean that, even though they're not blood related. Elphaba gets on the train late, dumps a bag of stale bread, cheese and oranges down for Glinda, and then tells her she's not coming back to Shiz. Glinda cries and tries to ask questions, but Elphaba tells her not to bother looking for her because she won't be findable. She leaves Glinda in tears and turns around and gets off the train. We've got another 4 or 5 year time jump here. So Fiyero graduated from Shiz 3 years ago and he's visiting the Emerald City for business. As the Prince of the Arjikis, he sometimes makes the trip to the Emerald City to meet with other political figures and represent his tribe. He's running early to meet some friends, so he stops at a chapel to pass some time. He's not religious, but he appreciates the architecture and the vibes. He wanders around the chapel and looks at the statues and shrines, and just as he's about to leave, he sees someone he recognises. Elphaba is in a quiet corner of the chapel with her head bowed in prayer. He walks straight up to her, but she doesn't seem to recognise him. He introduces himself, reminds her that they went to uni together, and asks how she is. She replies that she's got no idea what he's talking about. They go back and forth for a while, and eventually Elphaba agrees to meet Fiyero outside the chapel in an hour, once she's done praying, to prove to him that he's made a mistake. On the way out, he asks someone if there are any other exits to the building, and he learns that there is one side door which leads out through the cloisters. He thinks Elphaba's been acting suspicious, so he lurks in the shadows and watches her. A cloaked figure with a cane walks silently through the chapel and into the corner where Elphaba is kneeling. The figure doesn't linger, and Fiyero's too far away to hear whether the two speak to one another, but he decides to hedge his bets that Elphaba is about to try and sneak away, and he exits through the side door and waits. A few minutes later, Elphaba emerges from the same side entrance and moves quickly. She's absolutely intent on avoiding him, but he can't work out why. He's determined not to lose sight of Elphaba and begins to follow her. She leads him to the dodgy outskirts of the city to an abandoned, boarded-up building. Just as she's about to go into the building, he catches up to her. She pleads with him to leave her alone, but he insists. They argue a little bit, and they're obviously very well matched, both very quick-witted and sharp-tongued. He elbows his way inside, and Elphaba stops resisting. She shows him upstairs to an abandoned storeroom where she's clearly been living. It's very makeshift, but there are feathers and bones hanging on the walls. Whether for art or some sort of spell, Fiyero's not sure. He asks her if this is home, and Elpha responds, "Ask me no questions and I'll spell you no lies." She's not telling him anything. She asks him about his life, his wife, his children, his role as the Arjiki prince, and he answers all of her questions. But when he turns the questions on her, she's really reluctant to give any information. After a while, she admits that she left Shiz because she was so frustrated by everyone's reaction, or lack of reaction really, to Dilliman's death. She asks if Fiyero's in cahoots with the wizard because of his political role, but Fiyero tells her no. No one even sees the wizard at his own dinner parties. He's literally never seen in public. Eventually, she tells Fiyero that she'd cut off the friendship group from Shiz because she loves them too much to keep in touch, implying that she might have accidentally endangered them. She remembers the first day she ever met Fiyero in Dr. Nicky Dick's class and tells him that her first impression was of his beautiful blue tattoos. Fiyero is the first person to work out her identity since she left Glinda on the train all those years ago. She tells him he should stay away from her and talks about lots of unjust trials and unfair executions happening at the hands of the Gale Force, which is a newer and scarier version of the Emerald City Home Guard. She warns him to consider his allies very carefully and to prepare himself for a revolution. She tells him one more time to leave, but instead he touches her hand and looks at her just fast enough to see her face drop. What he saw there made him chill and hot flash in dizzying simultaneity in the shape and scale of its need. I cannot believe that I just said dizzying simultaneity first go.
Yeah.
Fiyero, stop it, you're making me blush. Anyway, Elphaba asks after Bok. Fiyero doesn't see much of him, but he ended up marrying Miller, and the two live together in Munchkinland. She's very unhappy, apparently, and keeps trying to unalive herself. Apparently, Bok writes an annual newsletter around Lalinmas, which is how Fiyero knows. What a thing to include in a festive newsletter. Elphaba thinks it might be because Miller grew up with money and has now chosen to live a much humbler lifestyle as a farmer, which is very similar to what Elphaba's mum had done, really. Looking around at the hovel she's living in, Fiyero thinks it might be hereditary. She asks about Crope and Tibbet too. Crope is still hanging about, working in artistic circles around the Emerald City. He and Fiyero sometimes attend the same parties, but they don't speak. Tibbet, however, has never really recovered from the trauma of what happened to him at the Philosophy Club. Fiyero is still in touch with Averick, and they get together in the Emerald City quite often. He keeps expecting Elphaba to ask more about his family at some point, but she doesn't. He thinks that next time he visits, maybe he should wear a more revealing shirt so she can notice the diamond tattoos on his face go all the way down his chest. I'm shy. Fiyero sends a letter home to his wife to tell her not to expect him home anytime soon because business is keeping him in the Emerald City indefinitely. He says she won't even notice he's gone and that her 5 younger sisters all live in the castle as well as their 3 children, so she's got plenty of company. He also tells Elphaba that his wife has regularly suggested that her sisters wouldn't mind keeping him occupied at night.
Laughing at my sister because she wants to form a harem. I'm just saying, if you really love me, you would share 'em. Ha!
This book is so weird, by the way, but that he's never gone through with it. In fact, he's never been unfaithful to his wife. At least, not until now. And then they have a very buoyant conversation. Mind my language, but Elphaba and Fiyero become absolute top shaggers. They meet almost every day and just go at it, apart from occasionally Elphaba tells him that they can't meet that day because she has to work. She never explains what this work entails, but given her secrecy and her interest in politics, Fiyero assumes she's working on some sort of uprising. Then there's basically a whole paragraph of Fiyero comparing Elphaba's pubes to his wife's pubes. I really could have gone my whole life without reading it, so I'm going to give you the privilege of not having to hear it. Back to politics, Fiyero's asking a few too many questions, and Elphaba tells him to stop being so curious so he can stay blameless. He asks if there's an assassination coming, and Elphaba doesn't say no, so he's reading between the lines. Weeks go by, and Elphaba and Fiyero both confess their love for one another, but also constantly debate the ethics of what she's doing, even though he's still not really sure what that is. She says there will probably be accidental civilian deaths, which Fiyero thinks is a tragedy. Elphaba says the real tragedy is the oppression that's already happening across Oz, and that a few little deaths are the least of their worries. He takes issue with the fact that she's shirking off all personal responsibility, and she says that she wishes other people wouldn't have to die, but that it seems inevitable. One day, while Fiyero is out, he witnesses a capital B bear cub being beaten to death by the gale force in front of its parents, and particularly as a dad himself, it really sticks with him. After that, he starts to see Elphaba's point of view a little bit more, but he doesn't tell her because he thinks if he tries to get involved in that part of her life too, it might scare her away. He also knows he needs to keep the wizard on side for the sake of his tribe, so he can't get involved in any trouble. Elphaba tells Fiyero that she needs him to stay away from her for 2 full weeks because something big is about to happen, and she needs some time to work on it. Elphaba tells him that even she doesn't actually know the whole story, which is a deliberate choice so that the Gale Force wouldn't be able to torture it out of her. While she's away, the Emerald City is preparing for Lurleenmas, so there are twinkly lights and gold and green decorations everywhere. Fiyero has a little bit too much time to think and almost feels guilty about cheating on his wife, but then he somehow manages to convince himself that the two are so different that being able to admire their differences actually makes him appreciate them both more. So really, he's doing his wife a favour. He goes into a scarf shop to buy Lurleenmas presents for Elphaba and his wife, and he's at the till when he hears a voice he recognises enter the shop. It's Glinda, and Crope is with her. I'm not really sure why, he's just sort of trailing after her, not saying much. She's now married to Sir Chuffrey and wears voluminous skirts and a tiara. She insists that they all have tea together and praises what the wizard has done with the Emerald City, saying it's much more cosmopolitan nowadays. She asks about Fiyero's family, and when she learns that they're not with him in the Emerald City, she immediately accuses him of having an affair. He gets very defensive, but she says it's just because he looks so happy. He tells her he's happy to see her, obviously. She gets so excited at the idea of a shiz reunion, particularly because she's recently seen Nessa Rose in town too. She seems almost desperate to see more of Fiyero and reminisce about their uni days, saying life now just isn't the same. Fiyero says he'll see what he can do, but makes his excuses, saying he'll be leaving the Emerald City soon because his children are waiting for him. He asks if Glinda has any children, but she says that Chuffrey is as dry as 2 baked walnuts. Glinda asks if anyone has heard anything from Elphaba. Fiyero says, "Oh no, God, I haven't even thought about her in so long. Definitely not been thinking about her pubes or anything." Glinda tells him, "Well, if you should see her, tell her I miss her still." And then Fiyero leaves without promising to return. Fiyero expected Elphaba to never come back. He thought she might have given him the 2-week deadline so she could get a solid head start. Once the fortnight had passed, he went to visit her and was so pleased to be proven wrong. He didn't tell her about Glinda or Nessa Rose because he didn't want to distract her from the big campaign, which she said was still ongoing, but very nearly ready now. She asks him to leave town before Lurlinemas Eve to keep him safe. He refuses, and she says that she's been practicing sorcery and will turn him to stone if he doesn't. He says the sight of her has already turned him into stone. Please, Fiyero, have some decorum. Elphaba insists that if he's not going to leave town, he at least needs to promise to stay in his hotel room and not go into any busy areas on Lurlinemas Eve. He promises he will be careful. When Lurlinemas Eve comes, Fiyero watches Elphaba from the shadows. She's covered almost every inch of her green skin in long, dark skirts, scarves, gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat with a crown-like cone. That's the hat. She ducks into the chapel again, but she's not in there for very long, and when she leaves, she walks quickly and with purpose. Fiyero follows behind her, heading away from the palace district and into a wealthy residential area. She reaches a town square, which is beautifully decorated for the holidays, and places herself opposite a theatre with a crowd outside waiting to go in. Fiyero finds a watching spot at the top of some stairs where he can see her from above. He watches her looking for someone and hiding something, potentially a weapon, underneath her cloak. The crowd keeps getting bigger and bigger. A carriage comes around the corner and Elphaba readies herself. Fiyero thinks her target must be inside the carriage. A coachman flings the door open and Madame Morrible steps out. Elphaba's hands move beneath her cape, but before she gets a chance to do anything, a door next to the theatre door opens and a dozen schoolgirls spill out into the street between Elphaba and Morrible. They're only 6 or 7 years old and the author describes them as small, creamy lumps of uncurdled femininity. And I'm not saying anything about that. The distraction gives Madame Morrible just enough time to walk into the theatre unharmed. Elphaba has missed her chance. Fiyero looks away for a second, and when he looks back, Elphaba is gone. He worries that the gale force might have grabbed her and decides to make his way back to her house in case she's gone straight back there. When he gets there, I'm going to read from the book here, his bowels turned suddenly to water, and it was only with effort that he managed to make it to the chamber pot. His insides slopped noisily, wetly out, and he held his perspiring face in his hand. Elphaba isn't there, which is probably a good thing because he absolutely stinks the place out. He pulls open a window to let some air in, but it's snowing outside and so it's suddenly freezing, so he turns on the stove to try and get some heat coming through. He opens the stove door and something flies out at him. It's the gale force. I don't know how they fit in the oven, but, you know, that's a minor detail. They brutally attack and kill him. Hang on, so let me get this straight. Fiyero is dead, and it might not have happened if he hadn't nearly shut himself. 7 years later, Sister Saint Elphaba is preparing to leave the chapel for good. Yes, Elphaba had been taking shelter with the Maunts, which are basically nuns, in the chapel. She'd arrived that Lurlinemas Eve covered in blood and in an absolute state. Unable to talk or explain, but she'd been taken under the wing of old Mother Yakel. She'd spent the first 3 years in absolute silence, 2 more years whispering, and then she was sent to work on the ward for incurables, where she cared for the dying. She wasn't religious, but she could see the comfort religion brought to others, especially in their last days. She'd worked very hard throughout her years at the Mauntery to forget everything about who she was before she arrived. It was too painful. It was far easier to switch that part of her brain off completely and lean into the purpose and routine of her new life. Until one day, an old friend was wheeled into the ward. Tibbet recognised Elphaba immediately, even behind her mask. Might have been the green skin that did it. He addressed her by her name, the first to do that in years. He joked, remembered stories, and criticised their old friends for abandoning him. He reminded her of who she was and where she had come from. And then he died. After that, the Mother Superior told Elphaba that it was time for her to leave and live her life. She had an apology she needed to make, and to do that, she needed to begin a very long journey. The sisters arranged for Otzi Manglehand to collect Elphaba from the mortuary. A young boy carries her bags onto Otzi's caravan and sits down silently. Otzi asks Elphaba what his name is, but she just shrugs. There are several caravans all travelling together. Most of the party were Gillicanese, and they were all travelling for different reasons. Business, family needs, visiting a friend, to pay a debt, to kill an enemy. They're travelling into Winky country, where there are lots of tribes and wild animals, so they need to be vigilant and stick together. Elphaba doesn't really listen to Otzi's instructions though. She's sad and tired because she spends all night up thinking. The cook on board has a massive dog called Killjoy, which the boy who left the mortuary with Elphaba takes a liking to. Elfie overhears him introducing himself as Lear and offering to be the dog's owner. The two become inseparable.
I think I just said insufferable. I meant inseparable, sorry.
And Elfie likes the dog too, but not his owner. The cook and Elphaba argue a lot. Somewhere along the way, Elphaba acquires a colony of bees, which she moves into the caravan too. I'm sure all that noise wasn't annoying at all. They travel for weeks with several stops en route and eventually reach the mountains of Winky country. The book says they couldn't help but feel the unsettling eroticism of the landscape, which looked like a woman lying on her back, legs spread apart, welcoming them, which is what I always think when I see mountains, personally. One night, the cook disappears. The rumours among the travellers vary from a kidnapping to a sleepwalking episode. Some even think he might have killed himself. But Elphaba doesn't care. She's just pleased to have some peace and quiet. They later find out from a tribesperson that a body has been found at the base of the cliff, which they presume to be the cook. The passengers start speculating that Elphaba might have ordered the bees to attack him in the night. But she says that's ridiculous because they would have heard him screaming if he'd been attacked by bees. Which is a fair point, it's not a quiet way to die. The caravan stops at the Scrow encampment. When the travellers step outside, they see an old woman being carried around by two men, like on their shoulders. She's clearly important, with two crows on her shoulders and lots of gold jewellery and crow droppings down her front. The woman is introduced as Princess Nastoya and described as the filthiest, least educated princess anyone had ever seen. The Scrow encampment is massive. Their tents are arranged in circles, with the princess's tent in the middle, like a little airy palace in silks and cotton muslin, and her advisors and husbands living in the next ring, with probably around 1,000 people living there in total. That's quite a big tribe. Princess Nastoya summons Elphaba for a conversation. She waits until Elphaba arrives and then pisses on the floor, maintaining eye contact the entire time. I'm sorry, I do just have to ask, why is there so much wee and poo going on in this book? I know it's sort of the least of my worries here, but it is so recurring. She encourages Elphaba to call herself a witch and tells her that she's going to give her 3 crows to be her familiars. She says that they share the same enemy and that if Elphaba ever needs help, to send the crows and she will come to her aid. She then implies that Elphaba had made a subconscious decision to kill the cook. Elphaba is adamant that she didn't, but the princess says, "You did on some level. You're a strong woman, and I can hear bees, you know." Elphaba says that her only wish in the world is to do no harm. The princess replies that she has a job to do and she must go and do it. She then immediately falls asleep, leaving Elphaba to return back to the group. The next day, the travellers set off again. Slowly, their numbers were dwindling as more of them reached their destination, and there were now only 10 left, split across 2 caravans. Elphaba, the bees, the crows, and Killjoy, the dog, stay in the second caravan, and everyone else stays in the first. They're finally getting close to Elphaba's destination, and they come across some members of the Arjiki tribe. They don't have Fiero's tattoos, but they do share some of his features. Still, just the handsome look of them ripped Elfie's heart into pieces. Eventually, they see the black rock towers of Kiamo Ko in the distance. Otzi describes Kiamo Ko as the mountain stronghold of the ruling clan of the Arjikis. It's a huge castle in the mountains, and it's also Elphaba's stop. The caravans stop by a body of water so the others can drink and wash, but Elphaba won't go anywhere near it. Killjoy jumps straight into the water and grabs something with his mouth. Otzi screams. It looks like a baby. There's no way to get to Killjoy without getting into the water, but as Elphaba runs towards him, a path of ice starts forming beneath her feet, which is never explained, by the way. She rescues the baby, which turns out to be an abandoned baby monkey. It's freezing, so Elphaba brings it into her caravan, which might as well be a zoo at this point, and it seems much happier in the warm. She calls him Chistery. The caravans pull up to the imposing castle with its portcullis and thin window slits, which were originally designed for shooting arrows out of. It had been built as the head of the waterworks when they'd been considered using Winky Country's underground water systems to provide for the whole of Oz. But the project had been scrapped, leaving the castle empty until it was seized by Fiero's father and the rest of the Arjiki tribe, and eventually passed down to Fiero. Since his death, it had been in the care of his wife, Sarima. Elphaba says her goodbyes to Otzi and the other travellers. Lear steps off the caravan, carrying a large bag. Elphaba asks where he's going, and he says he wants to stay with her, the crows, the bees, Killjoy the dog, and Chistery the monkey. Elphaba seems completely indifferent, saying it makes no difference to her, and turning to walk into the castle. And so Lear prepared to enter his father's house. When I read that line, my jaw was on the floor. Inside the castle, we meet Sarima, Fiero's widow, and her 5 younger sisters, who are named 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Did Gregory just get bored of coming up with names at this point? I'm not going to distinguish between them again, because none of them seem to have an independent thought literally ever. So for the rest of the book, I'll just refer to them all in one go. They're all still mourning the loss of Fiero, even all these years later, but the sisters are particularly sad about it because it means none of them can marry until Sarima remarries, and there are absolutely no love interests on the horizon. We also meet Fiero and Sarima's 3 children. Urgi is the oldest. He's gentle and he cries a lot, and he's the next in line to the Arjiki throne. Manik is the middle child. He's an absolute arsehole. Nor is the youngest. She's sweet and shy and very clingy. When Elphaba arrives, the sisters take her straight to a bedroom to freshen up before dinner, while Lear goes out to play with the children. Sarima tries to get more information about the surprise guests by asking Nor what she knows, which isn't much, except she describes him as a big baby, fat and strong, and Manik has been throwing stones off him to see if they would bounce because he's so fat. Manik is actually a menace. Sarima heads down to dinner wearing a necklace Fiero bought her. She introduces herself to her green guest, who replies, "I come from the back of the wind, and I've given up my name so often I don't like to bring it out again for you." Me when the boys in the club used to ask for my number. Sarima suggests that they all call her Auntie if she doesn't want to use her real name. Elphaba is absolutely desperate to speak to Sarima alone. She confesses that she went to school with Fiero, and Sarima immediately remembers him speaking about his green friend Elphaba, so she does know her name, but she doesn't tell the others or use it. She also remembers Nessa Rose and Glinda. She even thinks Fiero might have been a little bit in love with Glinda. There was something about the way he spoke about her. Elphaba blurts out that she thinks she's the reason for Fiero's death. Sarima doesn't want to hear it. She tells Elphaba she can stay, rest, eat, and they'll chat at some point the following week, which frustrates Elphaba because she's only come to Kiamo Ko to seek forgiveness from Sarima. Sarima is very welcoming, and she tells her sisters to treat Auntie Guest the same way they treat her, which was unknowingly a bad choice of words because the sisters all resented and despised Sarima and thought she was stupid for marrying someone who would die so early. A couple of days later, Manik convinces Urgi and Lear to stand on top of one of the castle battlements and piss over the side. His target is Elphaba because he's noticed her aversion to water. They ask Lear for more information about Elphaba and whether or not she's magic, but he doesn't seem to know much. Nor brings them a piece of straw from a broom she found in Elphaba's room, which had been given to Elphaba by Mother Yackle when she left the Mauntery. Yackle had told her the broom would be the link to her destiny. Elphaba had always assumed that meant her destiny was domestic, not magic. The children try to examine it for magical properties, and Manik tells Lear that if he won't tell them how it works, they'll push him off the side of the castle and see if the broom will catch him. Poor Lear literally pisses himself in fear, and then Manik gets bored of bullying Lear and decides to go and poke the eyes out of some mice instead. A week after Elphaba arrived, Sarima finally summons her to have that conversation. She's quite enjoying having someone new around to talk to, which is handy because the snow is way too heavy for travelling, so Elphaba is not leaving anytime soon. Sarima tells Elphie that she knows she's trying to make herself feel better, but she's not interested in hearing about Fiero's death, and it should be her choice how much she knows. Elphaba asks what she does know about it, and Sarima tells her that she knows it was violent, it happened in a love nest, and that his body was never found. She also has her suspicions about who is responsible. She found out that Fiyero was having an affair and thinks it was with Glinda and that her husband, Sir Chuffrey, had killed him in a jealous rage. I'd be pretty angry if my name was Chuffrey as well. She doesn't want to discuss it anymore and offers Elphaba and Lear their own tower to sleep in so they can really get comfortable while they wait out the winter. However, she says if they are staying, Elphaba has to promise her not to speak about Fiyero anymore. Elphaba agrees for now, but still feels that she won't be able to leave until she has confessed the real story. She loves her new room in the tower. It's got a big window which she likes to look out of. She's not too sure where Lear actually sleeps, but she knows that every morning he emerges from wherever he's hiding to clean the crow's perch and give her a cup of cocoa. Lurlinmus came and went. Urgy, Manic and Nor all got presents, but Lear didn't, which obviously made him cry. I feel so sorry for little Lear. He hasn't done anything wrong and he's so desperate to be loved and accepted. It's so sad. Elphaba doesn't even leave her room for a few days because she says she finds the whole Lurlinmus period just too upsetting, presumably because it reminds her of Fiyero and of her own guilt. While Elphaba's exploring more of the castle, she comes across a load of Fiyero's old books. Lots of them are texts they studied at Shiz, but there's one massive gold and purple book which she's never seen before. She thinks it might be a grimoire, which is a sort of encyclopedia of magic. She tries to read a page, but the letters move around and scramble themselves and she can't quite make any sense of it. She asks Sarima where the book came from, and Sarima explains that a long time ago, Fiyero was out with the tribe when an elderly man with a strange accent knocked on the door asking for a meal and a bath. Sarima, being the gracious host she is, welcomed him in, and when he left, he gave her the book as a thank you. He told her it was a book of knowledge that belonged in another world, but it wasn't safe there, so he'd brought it here where it could be hidden and out of harm's way. Elphaba says that sounds like bollocks because she can sort of make out some of the letters, and if it was really from another world, she shouldn't be able to do that. Sarima says she brought the book up here to store with the rest of Fiyero's books and completely forgot about it. She doesn't think she ever even told anyone it was there. Elphaba takes the book to her room. Around the same time, she starts trying to teach Chistery the monkey to speak. He does repeat sounds back, but not with much accuracy, and he definitely doesn't seem to attach meaning to any of them. Elphaba and Chistery are very close. The children make fun of Lear, saying she likes Chistery more than him, and by the children, I just mean Manic. He's such an arsehole. One morning, the children are stuck inside because of the rain, so they decide to play a game of hide and seek. Nor's the seeker, and she keeps finding Manic really quickly because Lear keeps hiding close to him, but really badly, and he's giving both of them away. Manic is fed up of Lear ruining it for him, so when the next round begins, he leads Lear all the way down to the basement. All that's down there is an empty room, except for the fish well. Remember the mysterious underground lake in Winky Country that kept popping up earlier in the story? Well, it turns out that Kiamo Ko has a direct line to it. Manic screws the lid off to the fish well, convinces Lear to get in the bucket, and then drops the bucket down. It smashes against the wall with a thud. Lear shouts up that he's hurt and that he's dangerously close to the water, which is rising because of all the rain. Manic ignores his pleas and slides the lid back on. Meanwhile, Sarima notices a caravan in the distance, which is headed straight for the castle. She panics because the place is a mess and calls the children to come and help, cutting their game short. The sisters ask where Lear is because he should be helping too. Urgy says he was playing with them earlier and maybe he's fallen asleep. Manic suggests they make a bonfire to get the attention of the travellers. See what I mean? He's such a dick. When the caravan pulls into the drawbridge, the door swings open and Nanny steps out. Elphaba is so excited to see her. She's brought a lot of bags with her, so she clearly plans to stay there for a while, so Sarima offers her one of the other bedrooms in Elphaba's tower. The sisters put on a big dinner to welcome their new guest and get to know her, but Lear is still nowhere to be seen. She reports that the wizard has appointed himself the Emperor of Oz, and there's now an enforced conscription. All young men must join the Gale Force. It's as if the wizard is preparing for something big. The next day, Nor and Irji run into their mum's room, saying they found Lear and they think he might be dead. They all run downstairs to the basement and pull the bucket up. Lear's body is bloated from sitting in water. Manic hears the drama happening, so runs down and says, Oh, is that where he was? He said he wanted to go down into that fish well once. Sarima sends the children away upstairs, and all the adults bring Lear up to the kitchen and put his body on a butcher's block while they begin CPR. Urgi and Noor come back with Elphaba's broom and the grimoire, hoping she might be able to use magic to save their friend. Manik says that maybe if they prick his eyes out with the bristles of the broom, they might open and it'll bring him back. Nanny is doing compressions and tells Elphaba to give him mouth to mouth. The book says, her fingers tensed at the side of the butcher's block, gouging splinters as if in an ecstasy of sexual tension. Which is such a weird thing to say about a woman trying to bring her son back to life, by the way, even if she won't admit they're related. Lear starts choking and twitching. They've done it. He is alive. But Nanny's still worried that he might die of exposure. I'm not sure what that means, but they take his clothes off and rub him with lard. I assume it's supposed to be something to do with keeping him warm. Either way, apparently it made Urgi feel very funny in his trousers for the first time in his life. It's just such an unnecessary detail. They're literally children. They wrap him in a blanket and pick him up to take him to bed. Sarima asks where he sleeps, but Elphaba looks to the children for answers. They admit he's been sleeping on the floor in their room. Sarima is absolutely furious and so embarrassed that he's been there all that time without even a bed to sleep in. Lear stirs a little bit and says the fish spoke to him, but Nanny tells him to be quiet and save his energy. She offers up her bed for him to stay in until they assign him his own. The next day, Sarima tells Elphaba about some of their tribal teachings. Apparently, tribal parents teach their children about hot anger and cold anger. Boys and girls experience both, but as they grow up, boys need hot anger to survive, so the emphasis is on things like fighting, killing, and sex, while girls settle into cold anger, which involves holding grudges, giving a silent treatment, and being unwilling to compromise or back down. Cross a man and you struggle. One of you wins, you adjust and go on, or you lie there dead. Cross a woman and the universe is changed once again, for cold anger requires an eternal vigilance in all matters of slight and offence. Elphaba tries to work out which one she identifies with more, but can't really choose a side. It plays on her mind all night and into the morning. She looks out of her bedroom window and thinks about it. She thinks to be successful, she would need to be able to access both sorts. She trains her eye onto an icicle, which breaks off and plummets to the ground. Below, Manik takes a step into the garden and is stabbed in the skull by the falling icicle. He dies. And I know I shouldn't say this about a child, but good riddance. When Lear comes around, he explains, the fish told me she was magic. She said that Fiyero was my father, and that Urgi and Manik and Noor are my brothers and my sister. Sarima tells him he must be imagining things because fish don't talk. She then says to Elphaba that he can't possibly be Fiyero's son because Fiyero was thin and he's fat. That logic definitely checks out. Elphaba knows that the fish has somehow told Lear the truth that she never could. By the time spring arrives, Manik has been buried in the grounds of Kiamo Co, and Urgi, Noor and Lear have all started attending the local schoolroom. Nanny had insisted. Oh, there was a pigeon. Oh my god. Sarima is still deeply grieving and has become a bit of a recluse, even taking her meals alone. Elphaba and Nanny walk around the apple orchard, and Elphaba learns about what her family have been doing since she's been away. The eminent Throp died a while ago, so assuming that Elphaba was dead too, Nessa Rose had taken up the title and is now living in Colwyn Grounds with Frex, Shell and Nanny before she left. Frex is near retirement age now and he's really mellowed out, but Nessa Rose lets her strong unionist faith rule every decision she makes. Those decisions carry a lot of weight now as a leader of Munchkinland. There are campaigns happening for the separation of Munchkinland from Oz, and Nessa Rose is walking a very fine line, but ultimately hasn't said anything yet that the Gale Force can arrest her for. Shell, their younger brother, has grown up handsome, according to Nanny. He's good looking, with clear skin, good speech, and a bold heart. There are rumours that he's one of the agitators for Munchkinland's separation from Oz, but they haven't been able to prove anything. He comes and goes from Colwyn Grounds as he pleases, causing trouble for the wizard. She explains that the wizard has created a mandatory youth camp, where Munchkinlander children aged 4 to 10 have to attend for 1 month every summer and are sworn to secrecy about what goes on there. Nanny tells Elphaba that Shell disguises himself as a potato delivery man to go in and out of the gates and gather information. Elphaba is obviously horrified at the indoctrination of children, so she turns to the Grimoire to see if there's a spell in there that might help her overthrow a regime, but surprisingly, she can't find anything. Nanny also tells her that Glinda had come to reconnect with Nessa a couple of years ago, not long after she took on the Eminent Throp title. While she was there, Glinda put a spell on Nessa's favourite shoes, the ones her father had sent to Shiz for her, granting her the ability to stand and walk without help. She doesn't need to be propped up anymore, not figuratively or literally. She can stand on her own. And now it's Nanny's turn to ask the questions. She asks if Lear is Elphaba's son, but she replies, "It's not a question I can answer." She goes on to explain. When I first went to the Montery under the kind offices of Mother Yakel, I was in no state to know what was happening to me, and I spent about a year in a deathly sleep. It's just possible I brought a child to term and delivered it. I was another full year recovering. When I was first assigned duties, I worked with the sick and the dying, and also with abandoned children. I had no more congress with Lear than with any other of the several dozen brats. When I left the Montery to come here, it was under the condition that I would bring Lear with me. I didn't question the instruction. One doesn't question the instruction of superiors. I have no motherly warmth towards the boy, although that does seem to have changed ever so slightly since the well incident. And I don't think I've ever gone through the experience of bearing a child. I don't quite believe myself capable, in fact, although I'm willing to concede that may be simply ignorance and blindness, but that's all there is to say about it. I'll say no more. And that's all Elphaba ever really explains about Lear. You never get the answers there. Over the coming weeks, Elphaba notices Nanny treating Lear a little bit more lovingly than before, now that she knows he's one of the family. Urgi, Nor and Lear aren't as close anymore now that they don't have to band together against Manuk. They all spend a lot of time alone, and because of that, they're all pretty lonely. Nor is 10 at this point, and she spends her time wandering around the Arjiki land looking for something to do. One day, she spots a group of Gale Force soldiers making their way up the valley, so she stops them, telling them she is the princess daughter of the Arjikis, and leads them straight to Kiamo Ko. And the thing is, Gregory, she didn't need to be topless to be able to do that, did she? It literally doesn't add anything to the story. Elphaba immediately tells them they must leave, but they refuse. Sarima runs in and tells Elphaba that the Code of the Mountains is to be welcoming, something she's benefited from, and she shows the soldiers inside. The sisters are absolutely beside themselves to have men in the castle for the first time in so long. So I was just filming that in like an old castle in London, and it's a Sunday, so there were people around. And I had made my peace with that. I was fine with it. But then I remembered what's coming, and actually I thought, I don't want to read that in front of people. So I've been a coward and come back to the car, and we're just going to have to pretend I'm still in a castle. Urgi avoids the men and spends all of his time in the chapel, but Lear hangs around them constantly. He cleans their boots and gets them water and looks up to them. Elphaba worries that their sudden presence in the west, where the wizard's men don't usually have a presence, might suggest there's trouble coming. Nor constantly tries to impress the soldiers too. She does their laundry, brings flowers from the hills, serves them snacks, flirts with them, and cleans their dormitory. One day, while they're out, she decides to give it a good clean, so she borrows Elphaba's broom, without asking. Then there is this really weird sequence of events where she takes her top off and puts one of the soldiers' cloaks on, and then sort of fantasizes about if one of them were to come in and see her like topless lying on their bed. Again, it is just so weird and unnecessary. Out of the corner of her eye, she sees the broom moving towards her, and it kind of hovers just above the floor. So she straddles it and it flies out of the window. So then Nor is flying around outside the castle on Elphaba's broom, cloak flapping and tits to the wind. Elphaba spots her out of the window and shouts for the broom to come back, so it does. And this is the first Elphaba's hearing of the fact that the broom can fly, and she wonders if Mother Yakel had known that when she gave it to her. One night, when everyone else is in bed, Elphaba takes the broom outside to see if she can fly it. It doesn't work at first, but she keeps trying, and eventually she does master it. But it seems like it's more on the broom's term than hers. In summer, she receives a letter from Frex, and this is the first time that she has heard from her father since she was at Shiz over 10 years ago. He says that he's actually not sure whether Nessa Rose is cut out to be the eminent throp, and he asks Elphaba to come and speak to her and consider taking over the title. He writes that Munchkinland has officially become an independent state from Oz. Elphaba has no desire for leadership whatsoever, but she would quite like to see her father and her siblings again, so she wonders whether she would be able to make it all the way to Munchkinland on her broom. So she tells everyone in the tower that she's taking a period of isolation and not to disturb her with visitors or food or anything, and she secretly flies away. When she arrives at Colwyn Grounds, she's shocked by the grandeur of it. It's even fancier than Shiz and Kiamo Co, and it's bustling with people on official business. Frex greets her and introduces her to the guards, telling them that she can come and go as she likes, and reminding them that technically the title of the eminent throp is actually hers. The reunion between Elphaba and Frex is quite emotional, especially on his end, but surprisingly warm on Elphaba's end as well. He tells her about several violent incidents from the wizard's men, which had eventually led to the Munchkinland being declared as an independent state, and that there hasn't been much backlash yet from the Emerald City, but they are kind of all expecting it, and Frex thinks it's going to be really bad. He hopes Elphaba might be able to help Nessa Rose, and if not take the title over from her, at least balance her out a bit, because he says that her religious urges need tempering. Basically, she's gone like a bit religion mad, and it's really skewing her judgment. He also tells her that Shell has disappeared behind enemy lines, and they don't know where he is. Elphaba goes to find her sister, who isn't even that surprised to see her, but she is still quite angry at Elphaba for leaving her at Shiz to deal with Madame Morrible by herself. And Elphaba spends the next few days following her around and trying to work out how she's doing in her new role as the leader. One day, an old woman comes and asks Nessa Rose for help. She explains that her maid has fallen in love with a woodcutter, and she doesn't want her to run away with him, leaving her maidless. She asks Nessa Rose to cast a spell and kill the woodcutter so they can't run away together, and she offers her 2 capital S sheep and 1 capital C cow in exchange. But Nessa Rose says, whoa, that's a bit extreme, and instead she offers to bewitch the woodcutter's axe so that it chops off his arms. Her reasoning is quite sad. She says because she knows that people without arms aren't as attractive, and obviously she has no arms, so she thinks that will stop the maid from wanting to run away with him. I think that's sad. The woman agrees to let her try it, but says that if it doesn't work, she will be back. Elphaba's really shocked to find that Nessa Rose can do magic, and Nessa says she gets it from the unnamed god, but Elphaba thinks she might be a witch. She sneaks out to the animal pen, and she's horrified to find that both the capital C sheep, both the capital S sheep have actually, I can spell, I promise, have actually lost their voices, and she frees them all. But as they leave, the capital C cow tells her that it's all pointless really, because now they'll just be killed and eaten instead. Frex holds firm in his idea that Elphaba will make a better leader than Nessa, and he keeps asking her to take over, but Elphaba just isn't interested in the title at all. He thinks that underneath, Nessa is too fragile for the job and too devout to be a central figure in public life, which is pretty rich coming from him. Elphaba says that she's still not remotely interested in taking up the position, and that if Nessa doesn't want it, she should just refuse it. And then Frex confides in Elphaba that way back in chapter 1, he was also having an affair with Turtle Heart. He knew there was a chance that Nessa might be his child, which potentially makes her the daughter of the 2 people he loved the most in the world. And he says that's why she's always been his favourite. You're not meant to admit to having a favourite, as if that's the biggest issue here. Elphaba approaches her sister one last time and they argue. Long story short, Nessa tells Elphaba she will leave her the enchanted shoes in her will. Without saying goodbye to Frex, Elphaba leaves on her broom, feeling a new motivation to finish what she'd started at Shiz and dig up Dillerman's old notes. When she gets back to Kiamo Co, she finds Nanny alone except for the animals. The soldiers have kidnapped Fiero's entire family, except for Lear, who had followed them willingly. I have many criticisms of Gregory's writing, but he really does know how to do a cliffhanger at the end of a chapter. 7 years later, Nessa Rose is at a chapel handing out prizes to children when a house falls from the sky, drops on her head and kills her. It had been blown from another land through the sky and into Oz on a tornado. The Munchkinlanders immediately started making jokes like, what's the difference between a shooting star and a falling house? One, which is propitious, grants delicious wishes. The other, which is vicious, squishes witches. Which, I didn't need to tell you, I just wanted to try saying it out loud, and I just did it first time round. They call Nessa the Wicked Witch of the East, and hail the young girl inside the house as some sort of saint. She has a dog called Toto, which is described as merely annoying. Elphaba receives the news by carrier pigeon when she's stitching a pair of wings onto yet another monkey. She has loads of them now, all living with her at Kiamo Co. She's spent the last few years experimenting, using Dr. Dillerman's research, Fiero's university notes, and the Grimmery to help her work out how to make the monkeys fly. But even then, it's been a very long process, with a lot of fatalities. Side note, why is she now alright with killing animals for her own gain when animal rights has been her thing this whole time? Although, I suppose she did have that argument with Fiero about being alright with killing people if it was for the greater good, so maybe she thinks it serves some sort of wider purpose. Who knows? She does know how to do it properly now though, and the monkeys seem quite happy with their new abilities. She's given up trying to teach Chistery to speak, but he's very good at flying. He's the one who brings her the pigeon's letter from Shell, telling her about what happened to Nessa, with all the details of her funeral. She hasn't been able to get Sarima and the children back, and she's tried absolutely everything. Luckily, Commander Cherrystone had taken pity on Lear, who he didn't realise was Fiero's son, and tied him up and left him in a sack in someone's barn, so he wasn't kidnapped with the rest of Fiero's family. He'd eventually made his way back to Kiamo Co. The wizard soldiers have a camp nearby, and he visits it sometimes because he likes the company, but Fiero's family are no longer there. Nanny thinks they're all dead. Elphaba is absolutely devastated that she was never able to get the forgiveness she'd come for from Sarima. She flies to Munchkinland for the funeral alone, leaving Lear and Nanny at Kiamo Co. Frex is old now. He's half blind and so incredibly sad. Elphaba shows him a page she'd ripped out from the Grimmery, explains that she can sort of read it but not completely, and asks him if he can. He says no, but that Elphaba always has been able to see things others can't. Glinda arrives, and she is absolutely thrilled to see Elphaba. She's wearing a massive dress which has panels depicting the history of Oz embroidered onto it. Get Ariana Grande in a dress like that for the premiere, please, I'm begging, or just give me one, I need to see it. The two go for a walk together past lots of scarecrows in fields. Elphaba tells Glinda she looks hideous in that dress, and Glinda says she knows it's excessive, but it's what's expected of her. Glinda had been one of the first on the scene of Nessa's death. She also calls Chuffrey her hubby, which isn't important to the plot, but it did upset me. Glinda says Nessa Rose died immediately, so won't have suffered much, and that there was no blood or anything, just her feet poking out. By the time Glinda had arrived, the Munchkinlanders were already fussing over the girl and her dog. The girl is called Dorothy from Kansas, and her dog, Toto, is a nasty little pooch yapping about her heels. What is with all the Toto slander, by the way? He's literally not done anything. Glinda has never heard of Kansas or Dorothy of Oz, so she tries to get her out of Munchkinland and over to someone who can help as quickly as possible. There are rumours that the wizard wants to take back control of Munchkinland, and with their leader recently deceased, Glinda thought it safest that Dorothy gets out of the way.
What happens if I just follow the yellow brick road?
So she sent her and her dog down the yellow brick road to find the wizard and sent the enchanted shoes with her to get them out of the way too. Elphaba is absolutely furious because Nessa Rose had promised to give her those shoes, and she doesn't want something that powerful falling into the hands of the wizard. Glinda tells Elphaba that Dorothy hasn't done anything deliberate to hurt Nessa Rose and that she seems like a nice girl, but Elphaba doesn't seem convinced. She also wants to clarify that Glinda definitely wasn't having an affair with Fiyero like Sarima had suspected, and Glinda says no, citing his dark skin as proof that she wouldn't be romantically interested in him. I have no words for this book sometimes. At the funeral, one of the wizard's representatives tells Elphaba that the wizard wants to see her. When she goes to meet him, he's literally just a man. He wants to know if she plans to take over as the eminent Throp. She says it's none of his business, but he says it is because the reannexation process of Munchkinland has already begun, and soon it would be a part of Oz again. He admits that he's had his army stationed near Kiamo Cove for all those years to keep an eye on Elphaba. He takes an interest in the Grimoire, asking where it is and where she found it. He can read the page that she has with her, and says she probably can't because it comes from his world. He explains that it had been taken away by a wizard far more powerful than him and hidden where no one could find it, and that he had travelled to Oz himself 40 years ago in the hopes of finding the book and bringing it back. She doesn't answer any of his questions. She asks where Sarima and the others are. He summons a girl in white clothes and chains. It takes Elphaba a minute, but then she recognises Noor. She's 16 or 17 now and won't even look Elphaba in the eyes. He says the rest are undocumented, but he believes Sarima and her sisters are dead, and Urgi is definitely dead because he was next in line to be prince and they couldn't have that. He'd been killed via public execution. Elphaba says she'll give him the Grimoire in exchange for Noor, but he won't commit to a deal. A few days later, Elphaba says what she suspects to be her final goodbye to her father. With his grief and old age, she doesn't think he'll live much longer. She walks past Glinda in the courtyard on her way out. They avoid eye contact. Once they've passed each other, Glinda turns and shouts Elphaba's name, but Elphie ignores her, and they never see each other again. Elphaba is fuming about the shoes and decides to track down Dorothy and get them back. Along the road, she sees Bok sitting outside a small farmhouse. He tells her he met Dorothy and he thinks she's really charming and friendly, although he does remind her of that weird picture he found in the library that time. Elphaba tells him that she goes by the name the Wicked Witch of the West nowadays. He says, people who claim that they're evil are usually no worse than the rest of us. It's people who claim that they're good, or anyway better than the rest of us, that you have to be wary of. He doesn't like to speak badly about the wizard because you never know who's listening, but he asks if Elphaba ever learned anything from Dillerman's notes. She gets really upset even at the thought of it and doesn't want to discuss it. He tells her that Madame Morrible is still living at Shiz and working for the wizard. Elphaba's had enough of talking, so she continues on her journey. She's annoyed with herself for not joining forces with Nessa Rose and building an army against the wizard, but decides there is one thing she can do. She pops herself over to Shiz for a quick assassination and smashes Madame Morrible's head in with a trophy. She leaves it in her arms with the trophy's inscription facing upwards for whoever finds her. It reads, "In appreciation of everything you have done." Worried that she might not get the credit she deserves for the murder, she goes to visit Averick in his massive house. She hasn't seen him since Shiz, but he doesn't seem particularly fazed and can't even remember her name. He's still stunning and charming as ever. He tells her he'd seen a carnival being set up just earlier that day and spotted someone else he recognised from his time at Shiz. A dwarf who had been a doorman at the Philosophy Club. Elphaba asks how he can remember the doorman at the Philosophy Club but not her name. He replies that the pair of doormen had really made an impression. The dwarf he didn't know the name of, and a woman called Yakel. Whoa, 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 whoa. Elphaba's asking the same question we all are. What the hell is Yakel doing here, and literally who is she? She tells Averick she killed Morrible, and he can tell people if he wants. Gets a bit tipsy on red wine, and then leaves, except she can't fly because she's drunk, so she's travelling on foot. She comes across the carnival that Averick had been talking about, and is looking for somewhere comfortable she might be able to sleep when she meets the dwarf that Averick mentioned earlier. He says his particular carnival stand is the Clock of the Time Dragon, and begins to show her the story of her life in puppet show form. He shows her the story of Melina Frax, who was off to one side yammering away to some peasants who were busy screwing each other on the ground before him. Literally why, it doesn't add anything to the story. And a mysterious stranger who fed Melina a drink from a green glass bottle. They sleep together and then the stranger snaps his fingers and a balloon with a basket comes in and takes him away. It's the wizard. implying that he could be Elphaba's real father. The story is over, but Elphaba has more questions for the dwarf. He explains that he is the keeper of the book and that his life's purpose is to keep the Grimmery safe and stop it from getting back to where it came from. She asks if he works with Yakel, and he replies that they don't work together, but they do seem to come across each other a lot. It's all a bit much for Elphaba to take in. She's feeling homesick for the first time in her life and is worried that search parties might be out for her because of Morrible's murder, so she decides to head straight back to Kiamo Co. When she returns, Nanny is busy writing a guest list for her own funeral, and Lear has finally caught the magical fish that spoke to him all those years ago. He says he's glad Elphaba's back, and she grunts at him and then goes to find Chistery. Lear comes back from a walk where he's been speaking to the wizard's soldiers. They've told him that Dorothy and 3 friends, a scarecrow, a tin man and a lion, have been in to see the wizard. Dorothy asks the wizard to send her home, but he said he'll only do it if she kills the Wicked Witch of the West first. Lear asks Elphaba what she would ask the wizard for if she could have one wish. She says she'd ask for a soul, and asked him the same question. He says he'd ask for a father. After another visit, he returns crying because one of the men had suggested they kill Dorothy's friends and hold her captive so they can use her for their own amusement. Make of that what you will. Lear's crying because the man was his friend, and he'd been reported to his superiors, who had stripped and castrated him and nailed him to a windmill to be slowly pecked to death by birds. Elphaba took this to mean that Dorothy has been given the highest level of military protection, and she goes out on her broom and kills the suffering soldier. She wonders if the lion is the same one she'd seen in Dr. Nicky Dick's class. She thinks the Tin Woodman might be the work of her sister's magic, but she's scared of the scarecrow. She doesn't understand how it's alive, and then wonders if underneath all the straw it might be Fiyero, hiding and trying to find his way back to her. She really hopes that's true. As Dorothy and her friends get closer, Elphaba is getting more and more excited to see Fiyero again, so when she knows they're nearby, she sends Killjoy, along with more dogs that are apparently now living in the castle, to find them and bring them to the castle quickly. But when the dogs reach the friends, the Tinman chops their heads off with his axe. Elphaba watches the whole thing and she's devastated, but she also notices that Dorothy is still wearing the silver shoes. She sends the crows to pull the scarecrow's mask off and peck out Dorothy's eyes, and then tells 3 of them to go and tell Princess Nastoya that she needs help, but they never get that far because Dorothy and her friends kill them too. Lastly, the bees are sent out, and the scarecrow takes out his straw to cover Dorothy and the lion to protect them. When Elphaba sees him all in pieces on the ground, she realises there is no way that Fiyero is inside. When Dorothy gets to Kiamo Co, she tells Elphaba that she never planned on killing her, but instead she wants to ask for forgiveness for killing her sister. Elphaba hates the irony of being asked to give forgiveness when she never got the forgiveness she came to Kiamo Co for. Somehow her clothes set on fire, and Dorothy tries to put it out by throwing a bucket of water over her, and it kills her.
Who thought a good little girl like you could destroy my beautiful wickedness?
As a witch, she has no afterlife. She's just dead. That's it. And that's it. And that's the end. There's no Fiyero as the Scarecrow, no Bock as the Tin Man, no Madame Morrible being able to control the weather, no Fiyero and Glinda, no Nessa Rose and Bock. We never find out what Elphaba was actually up to in the Emerald City, or who she was talking to in the chapel. Why is everything so sexually coded? It's so often just completely irrelevant, doesn't add anything to the story, it just makes me feel like I shouldn't be reading it. Who the fuck is Yakel? She gave Nanny the medicine, she sold Frex the shoes, she worked on the door of the philosophy club and then became a nun and gave Elphaba her mysterious flying broomstick, but none of it is explained. What happens to Shell? What happens to Nor? What happens to Lear? Well, you'll be pleased to know this is a series of 4 books. I'm not doing it. Unless this video gets a lot of views, then I might do it. Let's call it 100,000 views. If this video gets 100,000 views, I'll consider it. So if you liked it, send it to your friends and we'll see. I don't want to do it, but I also feel I kind of can't look away from it now. Overall, there were times when I hated reading this book. At points it felt really slow and confusing, and at other points it felt like the police were about to tap me on the shoulder and take me away. But I am glad to know the full story, and I hope you are too. If you've made it this far, leave me a comment and let me know if you prefer this version or the musical version. I think they're so different. They almost don't live in the same world in my brain, which is kind of fitting. Which is actually kind of fitting. But I respect them both in different ways. Thank you for coming on this journey with me, and hopefully I'll see you again very soon. And if there's one thing we can learn from this, it's don't get the shits and then open your oven, or people might jump out and kill you.